Chapter 1. The Junkyard Gamble. The sky above Zenthra 9's scrapyard was an endless haze of burning neon, flickering between shades of purple and orange as distant plasma storms raged in the upper atmosphere. It smelled of ozone, rust, and the oily tang of spilled reactor coolant, a scent that clung to the lungs and made every breath feel heavier than it should. Elias Rig Carter had spent the better part of his life crawling through piles of forgotten starships, salvaging parts and flipping wrecks for credits. He was a mechanic first, a racer second, and an idiot third, though the order of those often changed depending on who you asked. Right now, standing in the middle of one of the biggest scrap lots in the galaxy, staring at what had to be the most worthless, broken-down excuse for a ship he'd ever seen, he figured he was leaning heavily into the idiot category. The ship was a disaster, a relic from some forgotten skirmish, its hull scarred with plasma burns and meteorite impacts, its engines missing, and its cockpit half-melted from what looked like a catastrophic reactor failure. The wings were misaligned, the thrusters clogged with debris, and there was a gaping hole where the main drive core should have been. And yet, Elias couldn't take his eyes off it. "This is a joke, right?" came a deep, guttural voice from behind him. He turned to see Grivixel, a towering reptilian alien covered in thick armored scales, standing with his arms crossed, flanked by two of his cronies Jilvax, a six-armed insectoid, and Vorna, a feline-like Ketheri with piercing yellow eyes and an ever-present smirk. They were regulars in the underground racing circuit, known for their ruthless tactics both on and off the track. Elias grinned. Not a joke. A challenge. Grivixel let out a low, rumbling chuckle. A challenge? Carter, this isn't a challenge. This is suicide. Jilvax clicked its mandibles, gesturing toward the ship with one of its many arms. That thing wouldn't survive a gentle breeze, let alone a high-speed race. Vorna purred, her tail flicking as she circled the wreckage. Are you really that desperate for a ship? I heard humans were reckless, but this... She trailed her claws lightly over the scorched metal. This is pathetic. Elias ignored them, running a hand over the battered hull. His fingers traced the old insignia, half buried beneath years of grime and neglect. The shape was familiar. Too familiar. This ship wasn't just any wreck. It was a Valkyrie-class interceptor, a model that had been decommissioned decades ago, rumored to have a near-perfect energy-to-thrust ratio before being banned from professional racing due to safety concerns. The official reports claimed they were unstable, that their engines were too powerful for their lightweight frames, making them prone to catastrophic failures. But Elias knew better. They hadn't been unstable. They'd been too damn fast. Faster than anything else in their class. Faster than the Dominion wanted in civilian hands. And now, he owned one. Or at least, he would in about 30 seconds. Elias turned to the scrapyard's owner, a short, wiry Greek named Fib, who was watching the exchange with an amused glint in his 6 eyes. How much? Fib's antennae twitched. You serious, human? That thing's been sitting here for 20 years. It's not worth the effort to scrap? Elias shrugged. Doesn't answer my question. Fib considered for a moment, then waved a hand. 500 credits, and you haul it out of here yourself? Grivixel choked. 500 credits. Carter, you're throwing money away. Jilvax clicked in agreement. Even if you rebuilt it, there's no way it would ever be race legal. That model was banned for a reason. Vorna leaned in, her smirk widening. You're betting everything on a legend. Elias grinned, already pulling out his credit chit. Legends gotta start somewhere. Building a monster. Getting the ship back to his workshop hangar was a nightmare. It took 3 separate hover cranes, an argument with the scrapyard's automated loaders, and a bribe to get Fib to let him borrow a transport sled that was barely holding together itself. The trip across Zenthra 9's industrial sector was agonizingly slow, the ship's damaged hull groaning with every jolt and bump, but by the time he finally dragged it into his garage, Elias felt something close to satisfaction. Sure, it was a wreck, but it was his wreck, and he was going to make it fly again. The first step was stabilizing the frame. Years of exposure had weakened the metal, and the damage from its previous flight had left hairline fractures running through the entire structure. That meant a full reinforcement job layering and new support beams, welding the cracked plating, and replacing anything too far gone to salvage. Next came the wings. They were badly misaligned. One of them completely sheared off at the mounting joint. He had to fabricate a new one from spare titanium plating, cutting and shaping it to match the original design while integrating modern aerodynamics enhancements. Then, the thrusters. Elias had salvaged dozens of engines in his time, but this ship needed something special. The original model had relied on a prototype acceleration core, and since there were exactly 0 of those still in circulation, he had to build his own from scratch. It took weeks of tearing through old parts, reverse engineering outdated propulsion tech, and tuning the output to balance speed with stability. By the time he was done, the new core was something entirely different, not just a rebuilt engine, but an evolution of what the Valkyrie class had once been. The cockpit was next. The controls were fried, the wiring a tangled mess of melted conduits and exposed circuits. He had to strip it down to the base framework and install a new flight interface, hollow display dashboards, and custom manual override switches for fine-tuned control. Finally, the last piece, the paint. He wasn't just fixing a ship, he was making a statement. When it rolled out of the hangar, its sleek black hull reflecting the neon glow of Zenthra 9, its twin thrusters humming with raw power, it didn't look like a scrap heap anymore. It looked like a monster. And Elias had one thought. Time to prove them wrong. The mockery begins. The underground racing circuit on Zenthra 9 was a brutal, lawless battleground, a place where pilots came to prove themselves or die trying. Elias didn't care about fame or fortune. He cared about winning. When he pulled into the starting ring for the next big race, the reaction was instant. Laughter. Mockery. Jilvax practically fell over laughing, his mandibles clicking wildly. You actually fixed it? I thought you were just hoarding garbage, but this is insanity. Grivixel shook his head in disbelief. It'll disintegrate the moment you hit full thrust. Vorna purred, tail flicking. But you're entertaining, Carter. I'll give you that. Elias just grinned, settling into the cockpit, fingers gripping the controls. Then, the race marshal's voice boomed through the speakers. Racers, prepare for launch. Engines roared to life. Elias took a deep breath. The moment the countdown hit 0, he punched the throttle. And as the Valkyrie tore through the starting gate at impossible speed, leaving the others scrambling to catch up, the mockery turned to shock. They had laughed, but now they were terrified. Chapter 2. Rebuilding a Legend. The scrapyard stretched endlessly, a graveyard of forgotten starships, rusted hulls stacked atop one another like the remnants of a war long lost. The thick scent of oxidized metal and decaying coolant filled the air, mingling with the constant hum of power tools from mechanics who, like Elias Carter, had come searching for one last chance at greatness. But unlike the others scavenging for quick parts, Elias wasn't here to strip a wreck for credits, he was here to bring one back to life. The solar flare, as it had once been called, stood in the docking bay of Elias's small workshop, its skeletal frame illuminated by flickering lights that barely fought back the darkness. The ship was a disaster, panels missing, wires exposed, engines gutted beyond recognition. Whoever had last flown it had run it into the ground, milked it for every last ounce of speed before abandoning it like a wounded animal left to die. The exterior was still painted in the faded red and black of the legendary Varkellen racing circuit, a once great racing league that had collapsed in scandal and corruption decades ago. Elias knew the history. He had watched the last great Varkellen races as a kid, sitting in the cramped back rooms of repair shops, eyes wide with awe as ships blurred across the holoscreens, leaving trails of plasma and fire behind them. The solar flare had once been one of the fastest ships in the galaxy, piloted by a legend known only as Lyra Voss, a racer whose name had been whispered in hushed reverence long after her disappearance. Some said she died in a crash. Others believed she had disappeared into deep space, never to be seen again. And now, her ship sat before him, rusting, forgotten. Elias ran a hand along the battered hull, feeling the rough grooves where the metal had been scorched by plasma rounds, pitted by debris from high-speed collisions. Every scratch told a story, and yet, despite its ruin, he could still see it, the potential, the hunger, the raw power waiting to be unleashed again. He heard the footsteps before he saw them. A group of aliens stood at the entrance of his workshop, their glowing eyes filled with amusement. The leader, a towering Zendari with shimmering blue skin and a mouth full of razor-like teeth, crossed his arms and let out a low, rumbling laugh. "You wasted your credits on this?" he said, his voice thick with mockery. "This ship is dead, human. It belongs in a museum, not in a race." The others chuckled, their voices a mix of growls, clicks, and hissing laughter. Elias didn't bother looking up. He'd heard it all before. He pulled out a datapad, scrolling through old blueprints of the solar flare's original specs, comparing them to the wreck before him. He already knew the engines were gone, the thrusters barely functional, and the ship's primary navigational array was fried beyond recognition. But the frame? The frame was perfect. "That's where you're wrong," Elias muttered, more to himself than to them. The Zendari snorted, stepping closer. "Wrong? That ship hasn't seen a race in 50 years. The power core is probably older than your entire species." Elias finally looked up, his eyes cold. "And yet, you're here watching me work." The laughter stopped. Elias smirked. "You wouldn't be wasting your time unless you thought there was a chance I could fix it." The Zendari growled but didn't argue. Instead, he leaned against the doorway, his voice dripping with amusement. "Fine, human. Let's say you do fix it. What then? You think you can take on the circuit?" Elias leaned against the solar flare, crossing his arms. "I don't think," he said. "I know." A race against time. Fixing the ship wasn't just a challenge, it was a battle against time itself. The Intergalactic Hyperion Grand Prix, one of the most prestigious and dangerous races in the known galaxy, was 3 weeks away. Every engineer worth their weight in plasma coils was scrambling to enter, searching for the fastest ships, the most cutthroat pilots. Elias wasn't just entering a race, he was going to war. His first task was replacing the engines, and for that, he needed something that shouldn't exist anymore. The original Varkellen phase drive had been a revolutionary piece of engineering designed to push ships beyond the limits of conventional physics. It had been banned after multiple fatal crashes, but Elias knew of one last remaining drive, stored in a black market depot on Kellen 4, a planet ruled by crime syndicates and rogue traders. Getting it wouldn't be easy. Elias boarded his rusted cargo shuttle and set a course for Kellen 4, his mind already working through the risks. If he failed, there would be no second chance. No other drive in existence could give the solar flare the power it needed. When he arrived, the market was as dangerous as he had expected. Alien mercenaries patrolled the streets, their armor gleaming under the artificial sun, while black market traders sold everything from illegal ship mods to cybernetic enhancements. Elias found the contact he was looking for, a grizzled old Tarkari, his cybernetic eye scanning Elias from head to toe. "You've got credits, human?" the Tarkari asked. Elias tossed a data chip onto the table. "Enough to buy what I need." The Tarkari grunted, examining the chip before nodding toward a sealed container in the corner of the shop. "That's your drive. But you'd better get off this planet fast. Word is, the circuit doesn't like people digging up their past." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" The Tarkari sighed, his cybernetic fingers tapping against the table. "The Varkellen circuit may be dead, but its ghosts still watch. If they find out you're trying to bring back one of their ships, they won't just come after you, they'll make sure you never leave the starting line." Elias clenched his jaw. He had expected competition, but now, he had enemies. The last piece of the puzzle. Returning to his workshop, Elias wasted no time installing the phase drive, working through the night to align it with the solar flare's battered frame. The power surged through the ship like a heartbeat returning to a lifeless body, its engines roaring to life in a pulse of golden fire. For the first time in decades, the solar flare was awake. Elias stepped back, staring at his work, sweat dripping from his brow. The ship wasn't just repaired, it was reborn. And in just 1 week, he would take it to the Hyperion Grand Prix, where the entire galaxy would see that the solar flare had returned. The aliens who had laughed at him would be watching. And when he crossed that finish line, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. Chapter 3. The Test Flight and the Doubts. The shipyard on Zenthra 9 had never seen a spectacle quite like this. The skeletal remains of what was once the Starfire no longer looked like the rusted corpse of a failed ship. It had transformed into something almost alive, its newly reconstructed hull gleaming under the scrapyard's dull artificial sun lamps. The mockery that had surrounded Elias Carter's decision to purchase this wreck was beginning to shift into something else. The aliens who had once laughed at his foolishness now stood at a cautious distance, whispering among themselves, their amusement starting to wane as they realized what was happening before their eyes. The human had built something different, something dangerous. Elias stood near the open hangar bay, rolling his shoulders, eyes scanning every bolted panel, thruster nozzle, and reinforced stabilizer fin. This wasn't just any test flight, it was the moment of truth. The moment where all of his sweat, blood, and sleepless nights spent fusing reclaimed starship plating with custom plasma-resistant alloys would either pay off spectacularly or come crashing down in an explosion that would make the entire junkyard glow for weeks. His hands flexed against the edge of the control panel. He had been through this process hundreds of times, taking old wrecks and making them fly again, but this was different. This wasn't about credits. This wasn't about selling a half-functioning ship to some low-tier smuggler who just needed to make it through a few runs before the engines gave out. This was about proving a point. That humans were not weak. That he was not weak. That this ship was not a joke. He could still hear the laughter from weeks ago. The sneering Trinloth merchant, flicking his mandibles and clicking his tongue as he tried to upsell the ruined husk of the Starfire. This wreck? This is nothing, human. A dead machine. Even a scavenger beetle wouldn't nest in it. Elias had heard it all before. Humans were lesser, they said. Too fragile. Too new to the galactic frontier. Not sophisticated enough to build anything worth remembering. But that was about to change. He climbed the ramp, stepping into the pilot's chair. The leather cracked but familiar beneath his grip. The cockpit controls had been painstakingly rewired, each switch and dial placed where his muscle memory expected them to be. He had stripped out the outdated Dominion interface, replacing it with something faster, leaner, human-built. The ship's AI had been too far gone to salvage, so he had done the impossible. He had built a manual flight system into a vessel that had once been completely automated. Aliens thought humans relied too much on primitive instincts, on piloting by feel instead of raw mathematics and processing power. But Elias knew better. Machines can't make split-second decisions in the heat of a race. He pressed a switch, and the Starfire roared to life. The engine core pulsed, its unfamiliar yet thrilling hum vibrating through the metal plating. The power was there, surging through the ship like an unchained beast waiting to be set loose. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was damn close. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Curiosity had replaced mockery. The same aliens who had once jeered at his foolish investment now stared, some with arms crossed, some with murmured bets being placed. It won't even get off the ground. The hull will shear apart the second it accelerates. Humans don't understand high-speed thruster recalibration. He's dead if he tries full burn. Elias ignored them. He gripped the flight stick, exhaled, and pulled the throttle forward. The ship leapt off the ground. The scrapyard below blurred into a haze of rusted metal and rising dust clouds. The Starfire's engines roared, kicking against gravity, and for the first time in decades, the ship did exactly what it was built to do. It flew. But then a warning blared. Inertial dampeners unstable. Elias gritted his teeth, hands dancing over the controls, adjusting stabilizers manually. The ship shook, its frame groaning, as if testing its own limits. The modifications had given it raw power, but power without control was just a faster way to die. He adjusted again, pulling back on thrust output, compensating for the gravitational flux. The shuddering lessened. The ship held. A grin split Elias' face. Damn right you're still flying. He pulled back hard, sending the ship into a controlled loop, banking right, then testing a near-vertical climb that would have torn lesser vessels apart. The reinforced plating held, the recalibrated thrusters adapted, and as the Starfire cut through the upper atmosphere, Elias knew. The laughter was gone. All those aliens watching below? They weren't laughing anymore. The call to the race. Elias landed the Starfire smoothly, the newly reinforced landing struts hissing against the dust-covered pavement. The ship settled like a predator at rest, its engine cores still crackling with residual heat. He unbuckled his harness, exhaling slowly as he ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. Then he heard the slow clapping. He turned to see Jazek, one of the most well-known racers in the Quadrant A Zelvari, with 4 sharp eyes, a body built for endurance, and a reputation for winning. The alien grinned, his razor-like teeth catching the light. I'll admit, Carter, I didn't think you'd even get that thing to hover. Elias smirked, stepping down from the cockpit. And yet here we are. Jazek tilted his head. The scrapyard boys have a bet running. Half of them think you're gonna enter the horizon circuit. The other half think you'll back out once you realize you're not ready for that kind of speed. Elias' grin didn't fade. What do you think? Jacek studied him for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. I think you just might be insane enough to try. Elias dusted off his sleeves. Not just try, Jacek. He turned back to the Starfire, its newly reforged hull gleaming under the scrapyard's neon haze. A machine that had once been a forgotten relic, now reborn into something lethal, something hungry. I'm gonna win. And for the first time since Elias had bought that broken wreck, Jacek didn't laugh. Chapter 4. The Race That Changed Everything. The entire galactic racing scene had its eyes on Elias Carter and his once scrapped, now revived starship, the Iron Phoenix. From the moment he registered for the Velcor Grand Prix, the most dangerous and high-stakes race in the sector, the mockery had turned to shock, then disbelief, and finally, grudging curiosity. Elias had spent weeks modifying the ship, stripping away centuries of corrosion, reinforcing its frame with plasteel alloys scavenged from a war-era dreadnought, and installing a custom-built reactor that, if he was being honest, shouldn't have worked at all. It was a miracle of patchwork engineering, a ship that had no right to fly let alone race. But that was exactly why he loved it. Now, as he stood in the pre-race docking bay, the Iron Phoenix looming behind him like a metallic beast waiting to be unleashed, he felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was it. No more repairs. No more tests. Just him, the ship, and the race. Around him, other pilots and crews from across the galaxy whispered among themselves, some in amusement, others in scorn. They were all elites sponsored by corporate titans, backed by powerful syndicates, or hailing from species that were practically born to race. And then there was Elias, a lone human mechanic from a backwater world, standing beside a ship that had been rusting in a junkyard a month ago. He caught sight of Jorix Velon, a six-armed Zentari pilot who had been leading the public mockery of him since day one. Jorix was leaning against his own sleek, aerodynamic Zenthos-class racing cruiser, the Stormfang, an absolute monster of a machine with twin-ion disruptors and a custom anti-grav stabilizer that made it one of the most maneuverable ships in the circuit. Jorix sneered. You're really going through with this, human? After all that work, you'll be lucky if that thing doesn't fall apart before the first checkpoint. Elias smirked, dusting his hands off on his grease-streaked jumpsuit. That's the difference between us, Jorix. You built a machine to win. I built one to survive. The Zentari let out a low, guttural chuckle, shaking his head. Survive? This isn't a battlefield, Carter. It's a race. The fastest ship wins. Elias tapped the side of the Iron Phoenix, the metal vibrating with a deep hum of contained energy. Keep thinking that. The race was about to begin, and Elias knew one thing for certain: the galaxy was about to witness something they'd never forget. The Grand Prix begins. The race itself wasn't just about speed, it was about endurance, strategy, and adaptability. The Velcor Grand Prix was a multi-system gauntlet, spanning across asteroid fields, gas giants, planetary storms, and warp gates, testing pilots and their ships in ways that no ordinary race could. The moment the countdown hit zero, the universe became a blur of energy and light. Engines roared to life, a mix of plasma thrusters, quantum engines, and gravity-warping propulsion systems launching each ship forward at speeds that could liquefy bones under the wrong conditions. The Iron Phoenix, despite its patched-together frame, held steady, its newly overhauled reactor kicking in like a dragon waking from slumber. Elias gritted his teeth as the first stretch of the race, the asteroid belt of KUVAS 7, loomed ahead. Massive chunks of rock, some the size of small moons, tumbled unpredictably, creating a maze of death that required precision and guts to navigate. Jorix and the other elite pilots surged ahead, their ships slipping through the asteroid field with near-perfect maneuverability, their AI-assisted flight systems calculating every movement down to the millisecond. Elias? He turned everything off. No AI-assisted flight controls. No predictive maneuvering. Just him, his instincts, and the ship. As the first asteroid came hurtling toward him, he cut power for half a second, letting inertia carry the Iron Phoenix through a tight gap before reigniting the thrusters in a hard left burn, scraping past a tumbling rock by mere inches. The ship groaned, but it did not break. Elias grinned. The Iron Phoenix wasn't fastest, but it was tougher, smarter, and capable of tricks no pristine racing ship could pull off. Defying the odds. Checkpoint after checkpoint, Elias refused to fall behind. He made up time in ways the other pilots hadn't expected, cutting corners through gravitational slingshots, using planetary debris fields to mask his energy signature, and even outmaneuvering the AI-guided competitors by taking manual control when they relied too much on predictive pathing. By the time they hit the final leg of the race, only 4 pilots remained in contention: Jorix, a cybernetically enhanced RYYX pilot named Selkara, a silent but deadly Drakari mercenary called Vexus, and Elias. No one had expected the human mechanic to last this long. But Elias didn't just want to last. He wanted to win. The final stretch was a warp gate sprint, a chaotic free-for-all where every pilot had to navigate an unstable wormhole that spat them out at unpredictable exit points, sometimes ahead of their rivals, sometimes behind. Jorix, confident in his AI-guided navigation system, aimed for the most optimal entry path. Elias? He aimed for the most unstable one. As the countdown began for final warp entry, Elias flipped every safety override, feeding raw energy into his patched-together reactor and overclocking the ship's quantum stabilizers. The ship shook violently, the interior lights flickering as the controls fought against the reckless surge of power. Guardian would have told him he was insane. Good thing Guardian wasn't here. The warp gate collapsed the moment he entered, folding space around him in a violent implosion of light and gravity. The ship buckled, groaned, and screamed, but it held. And when Elias was finally ejected into real space, he was ahead. Jorix, Selkara, and Vexus were still several thousand kilometers behind, their ships struggling to correct their course after the warp gate threw them off balance. The finish line was in sight. Elias pushed the Phoenix one last time, overriding the failsafe that would have prevented a full reactor burn, sending the ship into one final, impossible burst of speed. He crossed the finish line first. A legend is born. Silence. For the first time in the history of the Velcor Grand Prix, no one spoke immediately after the race. Elias sat in the cockpit, panting, his body aching from the stress of the high-speed maneuvers and gravitational shifts. Then, the entire race station erupted into chaos. The crowd was screaming, betting officials were scrambling, and the other pilots were gaping in disbelief. Jorix stumbled out of his ship, eyes wide with rage and disbelief. That was impossible. Elias, grinning despite himself, leaned against his ship and wiped sweat from his forehead. You know what they say, Jorix never underestimate a human mechanic. A moment later, the race organizers announced his victory. Elias Carter, the scrappy human with the patched-up wreck, had beaten the best the galaxy had to offer. And just like that, a legend was born.